Good day. As I discussed in a recent video, the United States and the NATO leadership seem to be determined to test to destruction the ancient Greek proposition that whom the gods destroy, they first make mad. I say that because we have seen an increasingly bizarre and really very strange foreign policy pouring out of the administration, the White House and the administration in Washington, ever since the new administration was inaugurated in January. On the one hand, the United States has been trying to reassure China and Russia that it wants what it calls a predictable and stable relationship with both countries. It appears to recognize that it needs the cooperation of these two countries if it is to deal with pressing issues, international issues, which concern and affect the United States. We've had calls from the President of the United States, Joe Biden, to President Xi Jinping of China and to President Putin of Russia, in which President Biden appears to have gone out of his way to reassure both the Chinese and the Russians that the United States does not seek confrontation or war with either of these two countries and instead seeks a peaceful relationship and a stable and predictable relationship with both of them. There was even a summit meeting that took place between Putin and Biden, at which between Putin and Biden in Geneva, in which Biden again apparently told Putin that the United States seeks a predictable and stable relationship with Russia. Yet at one and the same time that the United States says these things to Moscow and to Beijing, its actions point in the diametrically opposite direction. Thus, we've had the new announcement of this grand policy of strategic confrontation against Russia in Europe, one which, as I've said, is clearly going to lead to a lowering of the nuclear thresholds. We've seen announcements from Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, that NATO will now expand its remit to encompass even the Pacific region, treating Europe, the North Atlantic, then the Indo-Pacific, and presumably the Arctic, and all points of the compass in between as part of his new zone of concern and interest, ending in effect any concept of NATO operating out of area, since now every region on the planet will be apparently or presumably its area. We've seen the United States sending its Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, to Ukraine and Georgia and announcing there that the United States is holding open the door for Ukraine and Georgia to one day join NATO, even though the Russians have gone out of their way to say that, as far as they're concerned, NATO membership, especially for Ukraine, is a red line. And we have now had a whole succession of comments by the United States which appear to chip away at the One China principle and which appear to be edging towards some form of recognition of the independence of Taiwan from China, despite the fact that the Chinese have repeatedly warned that they regard US support for Taiwanese independence as a red line. The result is that instead of relations between the United States and China and Russia stabilizing on a predictable and stable basis, as the United States says it wants, they are getting steadily worse. Moreover, there is now, on top of everything else, a deepening sense of mistrust, with the Chinese and the Russians no longer believing anything that the United States says to them, because the United States says to them one thing and immediately goes ahead and does the opposite. Anyway, we've had an extreme case of this over the last 2 days, and it relates to what is perhaps the most sensitive and hot button issue of all, which is the relationship between China and Taiwan and between the United States and China and Taiwan. And this has taken the form of a statement by Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, in which he has said that the United States now supports some form of participation by Taiwan in the UN system. Now, I think at this point a little bit of history is necessary, and I appreciate this can be tedious. I don't think without some knowledge of history this is really a comprehensible question. Briefly, Taiwan became in effect a separate political entity from China in 1949, when the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese People's Liberation Army defeated the Kuomintang forces of the former Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek and established the People's Republic of China across the entirety of the Chinese mainland. Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang and his government did not recognize the communist victory. Instead, they withdrew to the island of Taiwan, where they continued to preserve their government with US support. And the Kuomintang authorities, at that time headed by Chiang Kai-shek, continued to insist that they were the true legitimate government of China, and they continued to be so recognized by the United States. Now, at that point in time, the United Nations had already existed, and as a result of an agreement reached between the various great powers, the UN system, something very like its existing form, was created at the beginning of the Second World War. And various countries, the 5 leading countries of the Allied coalition against Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Fascist Italy, accorded themselves in the UN system 5 permanent seats in what was the UN Security Council. And China was one of those countries which occupied one of those seats in the UN Security Council, because China had been a key member of the Allied coalition against Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Fascist Italy. A fact, by the way, of which, to my knowledge, tiny numbers of people in the West are aware. The vast majority of people in the West are completely ignorant of the fact that China played a key role in the war against Japan, and in fact suffered more losses than any other country that fought on the Allied side, or indeed on any side, during the Second World War, except the Soviet Union. But anyway, that's another historical issue, perhaps to be discussed another day. The important point is that in the 1940s, the United States was the undisputed superpower in the world. It was the only power that possessed nuclear weapons. It dwarfed all other powers in terms of its nuclear weapons capability. And of course, its economy was immeasurably stronger than that of everyone else. Indeed, in the 1940s, US industrial production was greater than that of the whole of the rest of the world combined. And the US, it's probably fair to say, together with its Western allies, essentially controlled the UN system. And as a result, it was the United States and its allies who were able to decide which government should continue to occupy and have control over China's seat in the United Nations system and in the UN Security Council. And since they continue to recognize the Kuomintang government in Taiwan as the legitimate government of China, the Kuomintang government in Taiwan continued to sit in the UN General Assembly and in the UN Security Council and act there as a permanent member of the Security Council and, in effect, as a great power, disregarding and ignoring the government of the People's Republic of China, which at that time the United States and its allies did not recognize. And that situation persisted until 1971. In other words, until approximately 50 years ago. And then in 1971, the situation changed. A whole raft of new countries had by this point joined the United Nations, and they were at that point strong in their anti-imperialist and anti-colonialist fervour, having been newly liberated from the European colonial empires, and they were instinctively sympathetic to the People's Republic of China. And in 1971, the UN General Assembly accordingly voted to transfer the seat and place of China in the UN system from the Republic of China, Kuomintang government in Taiwan, to the government of the People's Republic of China in Beijing. And ever since then, for the last 50 years, the government which has represented China at the United Nations and which wields China's vote in the General Assembly and in the UN Security Council, and which has the status of a permanent member of the UN Security Council with veto power, is the government of the People's Republic of China. Now, that went along with a position that the only government able to represent China was the government of the People's Republic of China, and that it was the government of the entirety of China, including Taiwan. In 1971, Chiang Kai-shek, the former Kuomintang leader, was still alive and was still the leader of the Republic of China located in Taiwan. He continued to insist that he was the true leader of China, and the Kuomintang authorities in Taiwan at that time also continued to insist that they were the true legitimate government of China. And there was no thought or debate or consideration or idea then in Taiwan, or indeed anywhere else, of Taiwan seeking outright independence from China. The issue was not whether Taiwan was an independent state, it was which government of China was the legitimate one, the government in Beijing or the one in the Taiwanese capital, Taipei. In 1971, the United Nations General Assembly voted that it was the government in Beijing and not the Kuomintang government in Taipei. And that has been the position of the United Nations ever since. And the terms of the resolutions that the General Assembly passed in 1971 make this absolutely clear. They say quite definitely and definitively that China is the government in Beijing, is the legitimate authority over the whole of China, and the resolutions that were passed by the General Assembly at that time say quite specifically that the government in Taipei, the government and authority at that time still led by Chiang Kai-shek, had no role and no position in the UN system. And that has been the position that has persisted ever since, and it is a fundamental part of the One China policy and of the One China principle. In effect, it accepts that there is only one China, of which Taiwan is a province, that the government of China is the government in Beijing, and that the government in Taiwan, though a separate political entity, divided from the Chinese mainland as a result of the Civil War, will one day reconcile itself in some form with the government in Beijing, enabling the reunification of these two parts of China. That, as I said, is the official policy and of the United Nations. And it is the policy which, since the United States recognized the government in Beijing as the official government of China, later in the 1970s, the United States has essentially followed. It accepts, or says it accepts, the One China policy. It has never up to now sought to challenge the position of China in the United Nations as a single entity represented by the government in Beijing, and it has never agitated in any way for Taiwan to be granted any kind of representation within the UN system. Doing so, of course, would imply that Taiwan was some sort of independent state or entity and would cut across the One China principle, which is the one which the United Nations and the United States up to now has followed and adopted. Well, Antony Blinken, US Secretary of State, has now gone beyond that. He has in fact issued a statement which essentially undermines that position completely. And he's timed this for the 50th anniversary of the decision by the United Nations General Assembly to award China's seat in the United Nations and on the Security Council to the government of the People's Republic of China. And Blinken has done this in an extraordinary statement which appears in the State Department website and which I will now read in full. And it reads as follows: supporting Taiwan's participation in the UN system. And it reads, Taiwan has become a democratic success story. Its model supports transparency, respect for human rights, and the rule of law, values that align with those of the United Nations. Taiwan is critical to the global high-tech economy and a hub of travel, culture, and education. We are among the many UN member states who view Taiwan as a valued partner and trusted friend. As the international community faces an unprecedented number of complex and global issues, it is critical for all stakeholders to help address these problems. This includes the 24 million people who live in Taiwan. Taiwan's meaningful participation in the UN system is not a political issue, but a pragmatic one. The fact that Taiwan participated robustly in certain UN specialized agencies for the vast majority of the past 50 years is evidence of the value the international community places in Taiwan's contributions. Recently, however, Taiwan has not been permitted to contribute to UN efforts. Despite the tens of millions of passengers traveling annually through its airports, Taiwan was not represented at the International Civil Aviation Organization Triennial Assembly. Although we have much to learn from Taiwan's world-class response to the pandemic, Taiwan was not at the World Health Assembly. Members of civil society from around the world engage every day in activities at the UN, but Taiwan's scientists, technical experts, business persons, artists, educators, students, human rights advocates, and others are blocked from entry and participating in these activities simply because of the passports they hold. Taiwan's exclusion undermines the important work of the UN and its related bodies, all of which stand to benefit greatly from its contributions. We need to harness the contributions of all stakeholders towards solving our shared challenges. That is why we encourage all UN member states to join us in supporting Taiwan's robust, meaningful participation throughout the UN system and in the international community, consistent with our One China policy, which is guided by the Taiwan Relations Act, the 3 joint communiques, and the 6 assurances. So, let's just unpack some of this. Firstly, we see that Taiwan is referred to here as a democratic success story, and we learn that its model supports transparency, respect for human rights, and the rule of law, values that align with those of the United Nations. I would add that, of course, many member states of the United Nations do not abide by any of these values and manage to be friends and allies of the United States, but I'm not going to press that point now. The point is that this comment appears to give legitimacy to Taiwan's political system and implies that Taiwan is a political entity in some way superior to that of the government in Beijing, even though it is that government which is recognized as the legitimate government of China. The statement then goes on to refer to the people of Taiwan as stakeholders in a way that implies that they are somehow participants through their government, through Taiwan, in the world community. And in fact, if we go to the last paragraph, we see how the last paragraph specifically talks about Taiwan needing to be included in the UN system via meaningful participation throughout the UN system and as part of the international community. In effect, throughout the UN system and as a member of the international community means, in a sense, as an independent state. And then the comment goes on to say that Taiwan itself, it refers to Taiwan as a valued partner and trusted friend of many UN member states, with the implication being, of course, that it is a valued friend and trusted friend and partner of the United States itself. All of these comments, in effect, amount to saying that Taiwan is a state. And as a state, it should be allowed to participate throughout the UN system. Now, the word throughout is extremely important because whilst it is true that Taiwan was able to participate in some UN institutions in some form before, what this statement calls for is something much, much more extensive. It wants Taiwan to participate in every aspect, in every part of the UN system, except for the time being in the General Assembly and in the Security Council. But of course, if Taiwan is able to participate in every part of the UN system, except the General Assembly and the UN Security Council, but if it is also recognized as a stakeholder and as a member of the international community, then the next logical step is to grant it membership of the General Assembly and to admit it into the United Nations as a member state. So this is a statement which, whilst it continues to give token acknowledgement and support for the One China principle, in effect paves the way for Taiwan's recognition as a member state and for its admission to the United Nations as a member state. Well, This is the clearest, most explicit statement of support for Taiwan and for the independence movement in Taiwan that has been issued or made by the United States government since the 1970s. And of course, it comes just a few days after President Biden at that town hall meeting in Baltimore said that the United States is committed to the defense of Taiwan, something which, as I have said, was clearly not a slip of the tongue, but was actually an acknowledgement of a commitment which has undoubtedly and unequivocally been given. Now, China, of course, vehemently objects to all of this, and we will come to all of that in a moment. But perhaps what makes this statement particularly strange is that I cannot imagine that the United Nations, the General Assembly, will agree to any of this. I cannot imagine that most UN member states will line up and support the United States in giving independence to Taiwan. Most UN member states, the vast majority, continue to recognize the People's Republic of China as the sole legitimate government of the whole of China, of which Taiwan itself is a part. I cannot conceive that they would want to go back on that in a way that would compromise their relationship with the vastly powerful and indeed increasingly powerful government in Beijing. After all, the General Assembly voted in 1971 to give China the sole representation in the UN Security Council, the People's Republic of China, the sole representation in the UN Security Council and in the United Nations system, and it did so in a way that explicitly reaffirmed the One China principle and which explicitly rejected the independence of Taiwan, or rather the participation of Taiwan. So I can't conceive that UN member states would want to go behind the status quo. I just do ask myself whether Blinken himself and the State Department understand that, whether they realise that on this issue, the United States is not going to get the support it is looking for in the General Assembly and in the world community. In fact, I go further still. I suspect that some European governments, including perhaps and most particularly the German government, would be extremely unwilling, to put it mildly, to support this proposal, not wishing to complicate even further the bad relationship, the strained relationship that they already have with China, which they still consider to be a valued economic partner. So why is Blinken doing all of this? Well, I find it difficult to avoid the conclusion that despite all the claims and assertions about the importance for the United States of working with China on some collaborative issues, Blinken and people like him in the State Department have a kind of visceral feeling that China is somehow an illegitimate member of the world community. They see it as an enemy and as an adversary and as a rival, and they hanker for ever greater confrontation with China. I'm sure that is what this says, and it is, I'm sure, how it will be read in China. Because, of course, the Chinese will never accept this. And not only will they not accept this, but it will convince them, it will further convince them of what I suspect they're already coming round to believing anyway, which is that the United States, under this administration, certainly whilst Blinken remains Secretary of State, is steadily edging towards formal recognition of the independence of Taiwan. Now, we have had some strong Chinese responses. Firstly, we've had a strong comment from the Chinese embassy in Washington, which has vigorously challenged this statement. And we've also had a strong statement from the Taiwan Representative Office in Beijing, the office in Beijing, which of the Chinese government, which handles relations with Taiwan. But perhaps the clearest and strongest comments about this are, unsurprisingly, in the form of an editorial in Global Times, and I will read it in full. And it reads as follows: if the US wants to fight in the UN, China will battle back. And the editorial reads as follows: US Secretary of State Antony Blinken issued a statement on Tuesday which expressed US support for the island Taiwan's participation in the United Nations system. This is a gross escalation of efforts by the United States to undermine the One China principle and separate the island from China's sovereignty. In his statement, but Blinken touted that Taiwan has become a democratic success story and his values align with those of the United Nations. He also questioned why Taiwan, which has advanced aviation and public health, was not represented at the International Civil Aviation Organization and World Health Assembly. He quibbled that Taiwan's meaningful participation in the UN system is not a political issue, but a pragmatic one. The current administration is opening up a new battlefield to attack China. It is amazing that they can act like this whilst hypocritically advocating their adherence to the One China policy and adding completely opposite conditions, such as the Taiwan Relations Act and the 6 assurances, to what the US calls One China. They are playing rogue politics in broad daylight. Blinken labelled the island as democratic in order to assert the legitimacy of dividing China's sovereignty in a democratic way. He seeks to create the heresy that the United Nations needs to cooperate with such secessionist moves. He naively believes that US's values diplomacy will be able to whitewash this vicious secession into a just cause. He overestimates the coercive strength of American soft power. The United States is trying to create one China and one Taiwan in the UN and turn such a trick into a long-term bargaining chip to pressure Beijing. This is a new offensive against China. The world can see this, and Blinken's rhetoric will not deceive the international community. Taiwan's practical communication with UN agencies on civil aviation and public health matters has never been an obstacle. What the United States wants now is exactly a political breakthrough. They think the world is stupid. Taiwan authorities must accept the One China principle. Only through an arrangement on this basis can the island participate in international organizations. Before the current Democratic Progressive Party Authority, the Kuomintang Authority in Taiwan recognized One China, and a consensus was reached across the Taiwan Straits on issues including Taiwan's participation in the World Health Assembly. Since then, the DPP Authority has abandoned the 1992 consensus, and there is no longer One China in its policy declarations. Instead, all it repeatedly emphasizes is Taiwan's independent sovereignty. Taiwan's participation in the World Health Assembly is no longer pragmatic. It has become a political sprint to declare Taiwan's sovereignty to the world. By igniting a new UN fire in the conflicts with China, the US has once again proved that it is playing with words when it claims not to allow the competition with China to become a confrontation. Washington has stabbed Beijing in the heart of its concerns. It is trying to create a strategic initiative that will cause pain to China. Yet China will never back down an inch regarding the Taiwan question. The US treachery will never gain the support or be echoed by the majority of countries in the world. The United Nations is not run by the United States, and the United Nations Charter is written down in black and white, so the United States can't lead the global community to misrepresent it. Washington and the island of Taiwan will not succeed in realizing their conspiracy. They will continue to fail and humiliate themselves repeatedly. If the United States wants to fight, China will battle back. Evil will not suppress good in the United Nations, nor will it ever try to disguise itself as good. The next battle in the United Nations will teach the United States a lesson of international justice. So the Chinese are saying quite straightforwardly that they and the global community, notice that the Chinese talk about the global community rather than the international community, are not fooled by all of this. They can clearly see that Blinken's declaration is a step towards the international recognition of Taiwan, and that they will resist any and every attempt by the United States to change the status quo in the United Nations. But of course it goes far beyond that, because we see that global times, and by extension the Chinese, are now talking about US treachery. And let's face it, they have a point, because what else can you call a situation where the United States says to China one thing, that it adheres by the one China policy, and at the same time takes actions which diametrically contradict it? Why should the Chinese accept or work with or acknowledge this duplicity? And it is duplicity, and the Chinese are absolutely right to call it out as such. I would say that in some ways it would be better and more straightforward and certainly more honest if the United States simply and openly said that it supports independence for Taiwan. After all, the United States has supported the independence of other states around the world. It supported the independence of the various republics of the Soviet Union when they sought to break away from the Soviet Union. It supported the independence of Kosovo when it sought to break away from Serbia. So the United States could, in theory, come along and say that it supports the independence of Taiwan. But the United States doesn't want to do that, at least for the moment, because it knows that there isn't an international consensus behind it, and because it is also nervous of the reaction from Beijing if it did. It knows that the current government in China is much more powerful than the Soviet Union was at the moment of its collapse, and of course it is far more powerful than the government of Serbia was at the time in 1979 when the United States and NATO attacked Serbia. So the United States doesn't have the courage to talk about Taiwanese independence openly, even as it works to achieve it surreptitiously. And of course the Chinese are not fooled, and they are taking steps to respond to it. Now, duplicity always leaves an extremely ugly taste. And that's a point which perhaps many people in the United States, in Washington and elsewhere, don't seem to understand. This kind of over-clever diplomacy or foreign policy that Blinken and his acolytes in the State Department appear to be following, in which they support Taiwan's independence whilst denying that they are, doesn't make for a easier transition towards a position where Taiwan becomes, in effect, independent. It's not going to make the Chinese accept Taiwan's independence. It is going to make the Chinese even more mistrustful of the United States on every other issue. If the United States shows such duplicity on the question of Taiwan, why should China trust the United States over anything else? If, moreover, the United States, while saying that it wants to work with China on pressing existential issues, at the same time shows such utter disregard for China's red lines, why should China work with the United States and go along with this policy where the United States essentially has its cake and eat it as well? This foreign policy that Blinken is following and the United States currently is following towards China on the Taiwan issue is not clever. It is stupid. Now, I say that, and perhaps it's even more stupid than I had fully appreciated, because of certain commentaries that have recently appeared in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere about Taiwan's actual ability to defend itself. Now, there have recently been various commentaries and statements in various places about the fact that the United States would not be in a position to defend Taiwan if China were to attack Taiwan, that the Chinese military position in the areas contiguous to China's coast, in the seas contiguous to China's coast, is so overwhelmingly strong that the United States would be defeated if it tried to interfere in a fight over Taiwan, and that the United States would, at that point, if it were to try to do that, it would find itself in a situation where it were either comprehensively defeated or forced to go nuclear with catastrophic consequences for itself. Well, that I have long understood, and as I said, I've read multiple military experts. I'm not myself a military expert, but I have read multiple military experts that have explained this, and I understand that there have been war games in the Pentagon which have also confirmed the same point. But what I had not appreciated is that it seems that Taiwan itself is not capable of defending itself, and that the sole narrative of Taiwan heroically and valiantly resisting the People's Liberation Army is a myth. And we've now had reason to realise that that might not be so, because articles have started to appear in Western and indeed US journals which actually confirm that the Taiwanese military is in effect a paper tiger, and that its capacity to defend the island against China is, to all intents and purposes, non-existent. Now, there's been an article to that effect in the Wall Street Journal, but it is behind a paywall. So instead, I'm going to turn to an article which has appeared in Responsible Statecraft, which is a journal published by the Quincy Institute in the United States, and which essentially makes, though with less detail, essentially the same point. And it says the following: why is Taiwan only spending 2.1% of its GDP on its defense? And the article then goes on to say that it says the following: Chinese threats against Taiwan have spurred a debate in Washington over whether Washington should make an explicit promise to defend the island. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin made the rounds of Europe promoting NATO expansion to Georgia and Ukraine, officials from South Korea and Japan visited Washington to discuss America's continued commitment to their defense. America should stop being a pushover for supposed allies seeking a cheap or free ride. Consider Taiwan. George Mason University's Michael Hunziker recently told Congress that Taiwan's military is not optimally manned, trained, equipped, and motivated to defend against an attack, which is putting it mildly. Spending as a share of GDP has only slowly risen to 2.1%, a risible amount given the island's claimed fears of Chinese aggression. Moreover, complained Daniel Davis of Defence Priorities, so few Taiwanese are willing to sign up for military service, in fact, that earlier this year, frontline combat units in the Taiwan military was assessed as being manned at a shockingly low 60%. One reason for the refusal of Taiwanese to defend their own society, the expectation that Americans will intervene in any case. Well, we'll come to that in a moment. But it looks as if the Taiwanese military might be a hollow force. Moreover, the Chinese know it. And we read this in another article which has appeared in Global Times, this time under the written by Hu Cixin, who is in fact Global Times' editor. And it reads as follows: if cross-Straits war breaks out, sudden surrender of Tsai authorities is expected. And it reads as follows: the Tsai Ing-wen authority has said that the island will defend itself to the very last day if the Chinese mainland attacks. Most people know they are bluffing. A recent Wall Street Journal report quoted several experts as assessing that Taiwan's military has poor preparation and low morale. Also, adult men in Taiwan don't actually want to fight. The article doubted the island would stand much chance against China's People's Liberation Army. The report also advised that the Taiwan military could become far more effective by training with the United States. And how could it be possible to boost the low morale of the Taiwan military by training with the US Army? In 2003, I asked a former soldier in Taiwan whether the island is able to defend itself if a war breaks out. He made it clear that the answer is no. I then asked him how long he thinks the island could hold out. He answered, maybe dozens of hours. That was a long time ago in 2003. Today, the military capability comparison between the Chinese mainland and the island of Taiwan is completely different from what it was 18 years ago. From my point of view, first of all, the mainland doesn't want to fight a war. It has the will to safeguard peace and take to war as a last resort. Second, the Democratic Progressive Party authorities dare not fight. They are making bluffs, but they know very well that the island's military forces are weak. They cannot withstand even a single blow. If there is a war, Taiwan will be surely defeated and collapse. Third, the United States cannot fight there. Should it not go into a war there, the Taiwan Straits will be Washington's strong bargaining chip. Otherwise, the Straits will become the grave of American soldiers. The United States will suffer heavy losses instead of making gains. And so there we are. The Chinese know that the military of Taiwan is not up to very much. Just a few weeks ago, I reported here on my channel that the Taiwan Defense Minister himself admitted that the Chinese would be able effortlessly to occupy Taiwan from 2025 and that they would be able to capture it now. Claims that China would be bogged down on the beaches of Taiwan have always seemed to me implausible based on fantasies drawn from analogies of the D-Day fighting all the way back in 1944. But it turns out that even the most optimistic claims, or if you like, the most pessimistic claims about Taiwan's ability to defend itself, exaggerate its capabilities in this issue. Taiwan cannot defend itself. The United States cannot defend it. So why is the United States encouraging Taiwan to seek independence from China? And why is the United States implying that it will defend Taiwan when Taiwan cannot defend itself and when the United States cannot defend it? It all seems to me utterly and completely misjudged. Then, of course, we do hear stories about how the United States will impose some kind of economic blockade on China in the event that there is a war. But consider the economic realities. At this moment in time, the United States depends heavily on imports of Chinese goods, and these goods are playing a key role at the moment, not just in the overall operations of the US economy, but in terms of trying to control the inflation crisis that is rising in the United States at the moment. Imagine if there was a war over Taiwan and the United States tried to impose an embargo or a blockade of some kind of on China. The disruptions to the global economic system would be absolutely catastrophic. No doubt the effect on China would be extremely severe, though for the record, I think that the Chinese government would be able to keep full control of the situation. But the consequences for the West, for the United States, of that kind of confrontation are just frankly unimaginable. So why is the United States insisting on provoking China over this issue, when, as I said, the only consequences can be bad? Taiwan will be conquered, the United States will be humiliated if it goes to war. If it loses, it will lose, and if there is an economic blockade, which of course there would have to be, the economic effects on the United States itself would be catastrophic. I cannot see the logic of this policy. I come back to what I said at the outset of this program. Whom the gods destroy, they first make mad. This policy that the United States is following or pursuing towards Taiwan and towards China is mad. It makes no sense. It doesn't make sense in terms of the power realities. It doesn't make sense in terms of the economics. It doesn't help Taiwan. It merely makes it more likely that there will be a war there, and it creates strains and stresses in the vital relationship between China and the United States, which are simply not needed now. Let me reiterate again. The Chinese have repeatedly said that they have no plan at the moment to launch an attack on Taiwan. It's not what they want to do. What they want is, as that Global Times editorial said, they want to return to the situation which existed when the Kuomintang Authority were in control in Taiwan. A situation where the government of Taiwan continues to recognize that there is only one China, of which Taiwan is a part. It gives up any idea of independence, but it continues to maintain and preserve its existing political and economic system, putting the question of the reunification of China back to be resolved in a future time. That is all that China is asking for at the moment. It's not demanding that Taiwan become part of China tomorrow. Why is it so difficult for the United States to acknowledge the power realities and accept that? I'm going to add one final point to this. We've just learnt how weak the military position in Taiwan is, how the Taiwanese military is in no position actually to withstand the Chinese, and in fact there is no possibility of them being able to withstand the Chinese. But in fact it goes beyond that, because of course Taiwan could actually do a great deal more to defend itself from China than it is actually doing. And the editor of the Global Times actually describes the kind of things they might do. He says the following: if the DPP authority have the determination to fight until the end, they could change Taiwan's military service system by making it mandatory to serve for the military for all men, like Israel. They could cut all unnecessary expenditures and take most of GDP as a military budget. But Taiwan only has 180,000 troops on active service. Most of these, moreover, are strawberry soldiers. The DPP authorities hold the illusion to realize Taiwan secession by simply relying on US and Western opinions. And that's the clue. The reason Taiwan is taking no steps to defend itself is because it believes that it has a cast iron commitment from the United States, even though that is a commitment which, as I've discussed in many programs, the United States cannot honor. The fact that Taiwan believes that it has this cast iron commitment from the United States is an active disincentive for Taiwan to build up its own military. After all, if Taiwan were to build up its own military to the point where it might actually be able to give the Chinese a fight, then the United States would be able to say that it doesn't actually need to come to Taiwan's rescue because Taiwan is capable of defending itself. So Taiwan is actually, since it knows that whatever commitment it makes, that it cannot defeat China, it's actually incentivized to keep defense spending low and to keep its military weak, because that is the only way it feels that it can get the United States committed to defending it. It's a bizarre paradox, but again it shows the trap into which the United States is falling into as a result of its illogical policy. Anyway, I've spoken enough today about this program, about what I see as the bizarre and illogical nature of US policy. I've discussed it in many programs previously. I'm going to return to what I said before. The United States is now clearly working towards supporting some form of independence for Taiwan. It clearly believes that China is bluffing over the possibility of a war over Taiwan. It is making that assumption despite the steady growth of Chinese military power. It is also disregarding warnings from China that China is not bluffing, and it refuses to acknowledge that for the Chinese this is an existential issue. This is going to end in a debacle. Sooner or later there is going to be a conflict in Taiwan over Taiwan. That is beginning to look to me increasingly likely now. I don't see how this can be avoided, given the policy line that people like Blinken seem to be taking. It's an exercise of blindness, of arrogance, I would even say of stupidity. But there we are. It fills me with foreboding, but I cannot see now how this thing can be turned round. In the meantime, I think that any further attempt by the United States to try to achieve that predictable and stable relationship with China that we talked about at the start of this program, well, we can forget about that because it clearly isn't going to happen. Well, thank you for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me in future programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran. Please also remember to check us out on Locals, where we now have a thriving community, where I'm now actively doing live streams, and you can engage with me if you wish, and where other members of our community are also active, and where, by the way, we're publishing an increasing amount of exclusive content. You can also find us on other platforms like BitChute, Library, Rumble, and ODYSEE, and the new free speech platform SuperU. You can support us if that's your wish via Patreon and Subscribestar, and if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and also to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. I hope you will join me again soon, and have a wonderful day until then.